The Light of Other Days by Bob Shaw. Leaving the village behind, we followed the heady sweeps of the road up into the land of slow glass. I'd never seen one of the farms before, first found them slightly eerie, in effect heightened by imagination and circumstance. The car's turbine was pulling smoothly and quietly in the damp air so that we seemed to be carried over the convolutions of the road in a kind of supernatural silence. On our right, the mountains sifted down into an incredibly perfect valley of timeless pine. Everywhere stood the great frames of slow glass, drinking light. An occasional flash of afternoon sunlight on their wind bracing created an illusion of movement, but in fact the frames were deserted. The rows of windows had been standing on the hillside for years, staring into the valley, and only cleaned them in the middle of the night when their human presence would not matter to the thirsty glass. They were fascinating, but Selina and I didn't mention the windows. I think we hated each other so much that we both were reluctant to sully anything new by drawing it into the nexus of our emotions. The holiday, I'd begun to realize, was a stupid idea in the first place. I'd thought it would cure everything, but of course it didn't stop Selina being pregnant. Worse still, it didn't even stop her being angry about being pregnant. Rationalizing our dismay over her condition, we had circulated the usual statements to the effect that we would have liked having children, but later on, at the proper time. Selina's pregnancy had cost us her well-paid job, and with it the new house we'd been negotiating, which was far beyond the reach of my income from poetry. The real source of our annoyance was that we were face to face with the realization that people who say they want children later always mean they want children never. Our nevers were thrumming with the knowledge that we, who thought ourselves so unique, had fallen into the same biological trap as every mindless, rutting creature which ever existed. The road took us along the southern slopes of Ben Crucian until we began to catch glimpses of the great Atlantic far ahead. I just cut our speed to absorb the view better when I noticed the sign spiked to a gatepost. It said, "Slow glass, quality high, prices low, J.B. Hagen." On an impulse, I stopped the car on the verge, wincing slightly as tough grasses whipped noisily at the bodywork. "Why have we stopped?" Selina's neat smoke-silver head turned in surprise. "Look at that sign. Let's go up and see what there is. Stuff might be reasonably priced out here." Selina's voice was pitched high with scorn as she refused. I was too taken with my idea to listen. I had an illogical conviction that doing something extravagant and crazy would set us right again. "Come on," I said. "The exercise might do us some good. I've been driving too long anyway." She shrugged in a way that hurt me and got out of the car. We walked up a path made of irregular packed clay steps, nosed with short links of sapling. The path curved through trees which clothed the edge of the hill. At the end we found a low farmhouse. Beyond the little stone building, tall frames of slow glass gazed out toward the voice-stilling sign of creation's ponderous descent toward the waters of Loch Linen. Most of the panes were perfectly transparent. The few were dark, like panels of polished ebony. As we approached the house through a neat cobbled yard, a tall, middle-aged man in ash-colored tweeds arose and waved to us. We were sitting on the low rubble wall which bounded the yard, smoking a pipe and staring toward the house. At the front window of the cottage, a young woman in a tangerine dress stood with a small boy in her arms, but she turned uninterestedly and moved out of sight as we drew near. "Mr. Hagen?" I guessed. "Correct. Come to see some glass, have you? Well, you've come to the right place." He had one of those calmly dismayed faces one finds in elderly road menders and philosophers. "Yes," I said. "We're on holiday. We saw your sign." Selina, who usually has a natural fluency with strangers, said nothing. She was looking toward the now empty window with what I thought was a slightly puzzled expression. "From town, are you?" "Well, as I said, you've come to the right place. At the right time, too. My wife and I don't see many people this early in the season." I laughed. "Does that mean we might be able to buy a little glass without mortgaging our house?" "Look at that now," Hagen said, smiling helplessly. "I've thrown away any advantage I might have had in the transaction. Rose, that's my wife, says I never learn. Still, let's sit down and talk it over." He pointed to the rubble wall, then glanced doubtfully at Selina's immaculate blue skirt. "Wait till I fetch a rug from the house." Hagen limped quickly into the cottage, closing the door behind him. "Perhaps it wasn't such a marvelous idea to come up here," I whispered to Selina. but you might at least be pleasant to the man. I think I can smell a bargain." "Some hope," she said with deliberate coarseness. "Surely even you must have noticed the ancient dress his wife is wearing. Won't give away much to strangers." "Was that his wife?" "Of course that was his wife." "Well, well," I said, surprised. "Anyway, try to be civil with him. I don't want to be embarrassed." Selina snorted, but she smiled whitely when Hagen reappeared and relaxed a little. Strange how a man can love a woman and yet at the same time pray for her to fall under a train. Hagen spread a tartan blanket on the wall, and we sat down, feeling slightly self-conscious at having been translated from our city-oriented lives into a rural tableau. On the distant slate of the loch, beyond the watchful frames of sloe glass, a slow-moving steamer drew a white line toward the south. The boisterous mountain air seemed almost to invade our lungs, giving us more oxygen than we required. "Some of the glass farmers around here," Hagen began, "give strangers, such as yourselves, a sales talk about how beautiful in the autumn it is in this part of Argyll. Or it might be the spring, or the winter. I don't do that. Any fool knows that a place which doesn't look right in summer never looks right. What do you say?" I nodded compliantly. "I want you just to take a good look toward Mall, Mr. Garland. That's what you're buying if you buy my glass, and it never looks better than it does at this minute. The glass is in perfect phase. None of it is less than 10 years thick. A 4-foot window will cost you £200. "200?" Selina said, shocked. "That's as much as they charge at the Sindo shop at Bond Street." Hagen smiled patiently, then looked closely at me to see if I knew enough about sloe glass to appreciate what he had been saying. His price had been much higher than I had hoped, but 10 years thick. Cheap glass one found in places like the Vistaplex and Panorama stores usually consisted of 1/4 of an inch of ordinary glass faced with a veneer of sloe glass, perhaps like 10 or 12 months thick. "You don't understand, darling," I said, already determined to buy. "This glass will last 10 years and it's in phase." "Doesn't that only mean it keeps time?" Hagen smiled at her again, realizing he had no further necessity to bother with me. "Only, you say? Pardon me, Mrs. Garland, but you don't seem to appreciate the miracle, the genuine, honest-to-goodness miracle of engineering precision needed to produce a piece of glass in phase. When I say the glass is 10 years thick, it means it takes light 10 years to pass through it. In effect, each one of those panels is 10 light years thick, more than twice the distance to the nearest star, so a variation in actual thickness of only 1/millionth of an inch would..." He stopped talking for a moment and sat quietly looking toward the house. I turned my head from the view of the loch and saw the young woman standing at the window again. Hagen's eyes were filled with a kind of greedy reverence, which made me feel uncomfortable, at the same time convinced me Selina had been wrong. In my experience, husbands never look at wives that way, at least not at their own. The girl remained in view for a few seconds, dress glowing warmly, then moved back into the room. Suddenly I received a distinct, though inexplicable, impression she was blind. My feeling was that Selina and I were perhaps blundering through an emotional interplay as violent as our own. "I'm sorry," Hagen continued. "I thought Rose was going to call me in for something. Now, where was I, Mrs. Garland? 10 light years compressed into 1/4 of an inch means I ceased to listen, partly because I was already sold, partly because I had heard the story of sloe glass many times before and never yet understood the principles involved. A mind as non-technical as mine should concern itself less with cause than effects. The most important effect, in the eyes of the average individual, was that light took a long time to pass through a sheet of sloe glass. A new piece was always jet black because nothing had yet come through. One could stand the glass beside, say, a woodland lake until the scene emerged perhaps a year later. If the glass was then removed and installed in a dismal city flat, the flat would, for that year, appear to overlook the woodland lake. During the year, it wouldn't be merely a very realistic but still picture. The water would ripple in sunlight, silent animals would come to drink, birds would cross the sky, night would follow day, season would follow season, until one day, a year later, the beauty held in the subatomic pipelines would be exhausted and the familiar gray cityscape would reappear. Apart from its stupendous novelty value, the commercial success of sloe glass was founded on the fact that having a Sindo was the exact emotional equivalent of owning land. The meanest cave dweller could look out on misty parks, and who was to say that they weren't his? A man who really owns tailored gardens and estates doesn't spend his time proving his ownership by crawling on his ground, feeling, smelling, tasting it. All he receives from the land are light patterns, and with meadows, those patterns could be taken into coal mines, submarines, prison cells. On several occasions I've tried to write short pieces about the enchanted crystal, but to me the theme is so ineffably poetic as to be paradoxically beyond the reach of poetry, mine at any rate. Besides, the best songs in verses had already been written, with prescient inspiration by men who had died long before slow glass was discovered. I had no hope of equaling, for example, Moore with his "Oft in the stilly night, ere slumber's chain has bound me, fond memory brings the light of other days around me." It took only a few years for slow glass to develop from a scientific curiosity to a sizable industry. And much to the astonishment of us poets, those of us who remain convinced that beauty lives though lilies die, the trappings of that industry were no different from those of any other. There were good meadows which cost a lot of money. There were inferior meadows which cost rather less. The thickness, measured in years, was an important factor in the cost, but there was also the question of actual thickness, or phase. Even with the most sophisticated engineering techniques available, thickness control was something of a hit-and-miss affair. A coarse discrepancy could mean that a pane intended to be 5 years thick might be 5.5, so that light which entered in summer emerged in winter. A fine discrepancy could mean that noon sunshine emerged at midnight. These incompatibilities had their peculiar charm. Many night workers, for example, liked having their own private time zones, but in general it cost more to buy meadows which kept closely in step with real time. Selina still looked unconvinced when Hagen had finished speaking. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, and I knew he'd been using the wrong approach. Quite suddenly, the pewter helmet of her hair was disturbed by a cool gust of wind. Huge, clean, tumbling drops of rain began to spang around us from an almost cloudless sky. "I'll give you a check now," I said abruptly, saw Selina's green eyes triangulate angrily on my face. "You can arrange delivery?" "Aye, delivery's no problem," Hagen said, getting to his feet. "Wouldn't you rather take the glass with you?" "Well, yes, if you don't mind." I was shamed by his readiness to trust my script. "I'll unclip a pane for you. Wait here. Won't take long to slip it into a carrying frame." Hagen limped down the slope towards the Surrey windows, through some of which the view toward Lynn was sunny, while others were cloudy and a few pure black. Selina drew the collar of her blouse closed at her throat. "The least he could have done was invite us inside. There can't be so many fools passing through that he can afford to neglect them." I tried to ignore the insult and concentrated on writing the check. One of the outsized drops broke across my knuckles, splattering the pink paper. "All right," I said. "Let's move in under the eaves till he gets back." "You worm," I thought as I felt the whole thing go completely wrong. I just had to be a fool to marry you. A prize fool. A fool's fool. And now that you've trapped part of me inside you, I'll never, ever, never, ever, never, ever get away. Feeling my stomach clench itself painfully, I ran behind Selina to the other side of the cottage. Beyond the window, the neat living room with its coal fire was empty, but the child's toys were scattered on the floor. Alphabet blocks in a wheelbarrow, the exact color of freshly pared carrots. As I stared in, the boy came running from the other room and began kicking the blocks. He didn't notice me. A few moments later, the young woman entered the room and lifted him. Laughing easily and wholeheartedly, she swung the boy under her arm. She came to the window as she had done earlier. I smiled self-consciously. Neither she nor the child responded. My forehead prickled icily. Could they both be blind? I sidled away. Selina gave a little scream, and I spun towards her. "The rug," she said. "It's getting soaked." She ran across the yard in the rain, snatched the reddish square from the dappling wall, and ran back toward the cottage door. Something heaved convulsively in my subconscious. "Selina!" I shouted. "Don't open it!" But I was too late. She pushed open the latched wooden door and was standing, hand over mouth, looking into the cottage. I moved close to her and took the rug from her unresisting fingers. As I was closing the door, I let my eyes traverse the cottage's interior. The neat living room in which I had just seen the woman and child was, in reality, Sickening clutter of shabby furniture, old newspapers, cast-off clothing, and smeared dishes. It was damp, stinking, and utterly deserted. The only object I recognized from my view through the window was a little wheelbarrow, paintless and broken. I latched the door firmly and ordered myself to forget what I had seen. Some men who live alone are good housekeepers. Others just don't know how. Selena's face was white. I don't understand it. Slow glass works both ways, I said gently. Light passes out of a house as well as in. You mean, I don't know. It isn't our business. Now stand up. Steady up. Hagen's coming back with our glass. The churning in my stomach was beginning to subside. Hagen came into the yard carrying an oblong plastic-covered frame. I held the check out to him. He was staring at Selena's face. He seemed to know immediately that our uncomprehending fingers had rummaged through his soul. Selena avoided his gaze. She was old and ill-looking. Her eyes stared determinedly toward the nearing horizon. "I'll take the rug from you, Mr. Garland," Hagen finally said. "You shouldn't have troubled yourself over it." "No trouble. Here's the check." "Thank you." He was still looking at Selena with a strange kind of supplication. "It's been a pleasure to do business with you." "The pleasure was mine," I said with equally senseless formality. I picked up the heavy frame and guided Selena toward the path which led to the road. Just as we reached the head of the now slippery steps, Hagen spoke again. "Mr. Garland." I turned unwillingly. "It wasn't my fault," he said steadily. "A hit-and-run driver got them both down the Oban Road 6 years ago. My boy was only 7 when it happened. I'm entitled to keep something." I nodded wordlessly and moved down the path, holding my wife close to me, treasuring the feel of her arms locked around me. At the bend, I looked back through the rain and saw Hagen sitting with squared shoulders on the wall where we had first seen him. He was looking at the house. I was unable to tell if there was anyone in the window.